Good morning. This is me. This is me. Yeah, absolutely, it's me. It's nobody else. It's me. You can tell it's me because it looks like me and it sounds like me. And those of you who know me will know that it's me. So it's me. So I've been asked to talk about photography a little bit. I have a friend who's got a job application coming up in a couple of days, and he's asked me to walk him through photography so he doesn't sound too stupid. Anyway, so I figured I'd go through the basics. What are the basics? Photography is all about capturing light on a medium, whether it's digital or film, and then taking that medium to take the image and reproduce it somehow, either on paper, if you're using film, or onto another electronic medium, such as a print for the digital, or Facebook, God bless Facebook, or Instagram, or print, or whatever. So that's whatever you want to do with it, you can do it the same with both in terms of getting the output. You can scan your film and deal with it as though it was shot with a digital camera. You can have your digital camera and do what you want with it. The elements of photography are the following. Well, my camera is starting to run out of batteries. The elements of photography are the following. The first is, it's not fair to compare cameras to the eyeball. I know the eyeball works in many ways. You can compare the eyeball to the way a lens works because it has diaphragm and it has focusing. But I don't think there's anything analogous to ISO or ASA or ISO, International Standards Organization, or American Standards Association, for the sensitivity of the film, or the in brackets sensitivity of the sensor. We're going to be talking, I'm going to be talking mostly about digital cameras. The eyeball being analogous for both works fine. The eyeball, when you look at yourself in the mirror, you close your eyes, turn off the light, and then turn the light on really quickly and look at your eyeballs, you will see that your diaphragm, or the iris in your eye, closes down very quickly. That's equivalent to the aperture on your eyeball, on your camera. The camera aperture is broken down into f-stops. Depending on the lens on your camera, it'll be from 2.8 to f22, or 1.8 to whatever. A lot of the digital cameras these days don't have f-stops on them. They control that electronically inside, so you can't actually choose it on the outside of the lens like you could with the old school cameras, or the old school lenses. You take a older lens, or you get a lens that's a good lens and put it on your digital camera, put it on manual mode. You can control the aperture by turning the ring and shutting down the aperture. So what does the aperture do? It decreases the amount of light. It's referred to stops, have full stops and half stops. F2 to F4 is a full stop. That's double the amount of light, going from F4 down to F2. I'm saying down because the number is down, but you're increasing by one full stop the amount of light. A half stop is going from 2 to 2.8 to 4, and that's where you get half stop. You'd think it would be 3, but we don't have F3, we have 2.8. I don't know why. The other thing that you'll notice with where the eyeball and the f-stop, the lens, are analogous, is you have more automatically in focus with your eye when it's really bright out, and also with your lens when you go down to f16 or f22. This is what we refer to as depth of field. Depth of field is the amount of focus, amount of stuff that's in focus sharply in focus, critically focused, technically in focus. It means that all the grains, if you're using film, are nicely sharp and crisp and clean. If you had somebody's eyeball anywhere in that range of depth of field, the eyeball would be sharp and crisp, and you could see all the stuff in their eyeball. You could see their lashes and their eyebrows, all that stuff. The depth of field might start at 10 feet, 3 meters, and be in focus to 12 feet. It might be, if you're focusing really close to something, it might be focused at 20 centimeters to 22 centimeters. The depth of field could be very, very short. I was taking photographs the other day of some bees on the balcony, and the front of the bee was in focus and the back of the bee was out of focus. That's very narrow depth of field. Why was I using a narrow depth of field? Because I didn't have that much light outside at the time, so I had to have the shutter, the aperture, what we refer to as wide open. In my case, it was at, what was I using? 3.5, 3.8, f4, let's say f4. So that lens wide open at f4, we refer to it as wide open when the aperture is at its openness state, fully open. When it's fully open, the lens is wide open and your depth of field is very narrow. That depth of field changes on the focal length of your lens. Again, your eyeball doesn't have multiple focal lengths, but it has the ability for the brain to focus in detail on one small part of the image and ignore the rest. Whereas the camera takes a picture, if you're using a wide-angle lens, it's going to put the same emphasis on the entire vista. Whereas with your eye, you can have a large view of the world in front of you, and you can take your eyes and focus on some trees far away, and everything else will be out of focus except that one little bit you're looking at. There have been people who have tried to figure out what is the effect of megapixels of what an eyeball sees, and I think the latest thing I've read is that it's somewhere around 25 megapixels when it's focused on something, just one thing that it's focused on at distance. I don't know if that's true, and I don't care. So the lens is responsible for controlling the focal length. So if we take a 28 millimeter lens, that's considered a wide angle lens. And if we say 28 millimeters, what do we mean by 28 millimeters? It means that the focal center of the lens is 28 millimeters away from the plane of the sensor or the film. So if you think about a 28 millimeter wide angle lens, it's typically a short little lens, and the center of the lens is going to be 28 millimeters away from the film or the sensor. I'm looking at a huge bird flying by out the window. That's why I've become distracted. It's I think it might be a turkey vulture. Yeah, it's a turkey vulture. Now my eyes are really focused on that one thing. So if you have a 35 millimeter lens, again, the center focus point of the lens is going to be 35 millimeters away from the sensor, etc. When we start talking about telephoto lenses, a telephoto lens typically is anything where it starts to magnify the focal length. So if you're using a full frame sensor with a 35 millimeter lens, the 35 millimeter lens is almost exactly not magnifying the picture. In other words, it's almost what you would see in reality. Now that's a little trickery because it's not the entire vista of what you see, so it kind of tricks you into thinking it's not the full picture, because your camera doesn't go full wide. If you get a fisheye lens and put it on your camera, it'll get maybe the full vista that your eyes will see, but everything will definitely look farther away because your eye isn't used to looking at it like that. So when we're still talking about lenses, we need to talk about prime lenses. So prime lenses are lenses which are fixed focal length. Typically they will come at 28 millimeters, 35 millimeters, 50 millimeters, 85 millimeters, or 90 or 80, somewhere in there, depending on what kind of camera you're using, and then up to 200, 150. And again, I'm talking about full frame sensors right now. Cameras with full frame sensors, and that's a whole other discussion. That has to do with the sensitivity and the size of the actual pixels or receptors on the sensor itself. So the lens clearly is I would say, the most important part of your camera setup. It's kind of like the old school record player. The most important part of your record player was the needle that picked up the signal. If that was sucked, there was no way you could improve the suckiness of the needle. A speaker is a speaker, more or less. I mean, you can obviously improve the speaker by doing all kinds of stuff. The amplifiers pretty much do the same thing, but really the pickup thing was the most important. So for photography, the optics is really important. And that's why you can see some manufacturers of lenses selling 35 millimeter lenses, upwards of, $3,000 and $4,000, $5,000 for a lens, and you can pick one up on Facebook Marketplace for $20, which I just did the other day. I picked up an old Olympus lens for $50. Works great. So that's how a lens works. You have to think about focal length, you have to think about aperture, you have to think about the matching the focal length to the camera correctly. The next thing is sensitivity of the sensor, or ISO, or ASA. So again, the eyeball doesn't really have any similarity and anything that's analogous to ISO on the human brain. The reason is that it could. I don't know how it works inside the brain, but the ISO is the sensitivity of the film. So if you take an ISO or an ASA of 100 on your camera, you set it to 100, and you keep your aperture at the same setting and the shutter speed, which I will talk about, at the same setting, and you change your ISO from 100 to 200, it is going to be twice as sensitive to light. So in other words, if you are using 100 ISO and everything else is perfect, and your lens is at 5.6 and your shutter speed is at 500th of a second, you then will need to increase your shutter speed from 500 to 1,000th of a second if you go from ISO 100 to 200, because your sensor is now twice as sensitive. If you go from ISO 100 to 50, you need to increase the size of your aperture from 5.6 down to 4, or you need to decrease your shutter speed from 500 down to 250. It's very simple. The problem with ISO for film and for digital is the higher the number you go for ISO, the more grain and other secondary effects get on the film or the sensor. Grain is typically something that we don't like to see on our picture. You want it to be very, very sharp. Clearly, if the grain is the size of the pixel, you're going to end up with a very, very soft image. It's not going to be clear, it's not going to be crisp, it's going to look like crap, basically. So ISO is one of the tools we use to work in low light. You take your camera and you set it at ISO 3200 or 6400, and you'll be able to use your camera at maybe a 60th of a second or a 30th of a second for the shutter speed, and that will allow you to get relatively stable pictures, depending on the focal length. So let's go back to focal length and shutter speed for a minute. We'll talk about those two guys for a minute. Typically, you can take the focal length of your lens and double it to get the speed that with which you can hold the camera and successfully get a really sharp image. My phone is beeping. Somebody is sending me a text message. Let me see what it is. All right. That was actually a message from the individual who wants to give me, wants to come over to learn about photography. So that's a rule of thumb. There are people who can hold their camera much more stably than that. If you've got a 200 millimeter lens, they say you should shoot at least at 400 to get a stable shot. So then you need to be able to adjust the aperture of your lens and your ISO to accommodate those particular idiosyncrasies. The sensitivity of the sensor is important because there are what are called native ISOs, or native settings, where the grain is definitely less impacted or less visible. For example, with my Sony camera, the ISO is very minimal, if not negligible, at 640 ISO or ASA, which means that 640 is low. Typically, I shoot at 100 if I'm going on normal photography, but if I'm shooting a low light, I would go to 640. And if I can't hold the camera, oh, what's it say on the screen? I just said something. I think I'm almost out of battery. Yeah. I think I'm going to be out of batteries in a minute, so I'll stop there. Thus concludes lesson 1.